morning mist hung low over Fallow Hill, softening the jagged outlines of the hedgerows and muffling the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones. It was the sort of morning that suggested both promise and foreboding, a delicate balance that Miss Marple had long learned to read in the world around her. She stood at the crest of the hill, a light shawl draped around her shoulders, her sharp eyes tracing the faint impressions pressed into the damp earth. Footprints. Not ordinary ones. They were uneven, hurried, and told a story that most would overlook entirely. A tale of fear, urgency, and perhaps even desperation. Miss Marple's attention to detail had served her well for decades, and her instinct told her that these prints were the first tangible clue in what might unravel into something far more sinister than the local village squabbles she was accustomed to. She noted the depth of the impressions, the way the heel had pressed more forcefully into the soil than the toes, the sporadic smears that suggested a stumble or a sudden change in direction. Something, or someone, had been moving quickly through this otherwise serene landscape, and they had been alone. She squinted toward the edge of the hill, where the ground leveled into the pale green of cultivated fields, and felt the familiar stirrings of anticipation that always preceded an investigation. There was a story here. The question was, whose? The village below, with its quiet lanes and neatly ordered cottages, looked as it always did on a Monday morning. Laundry hung from lines, birds skittered across rooftops, and the occasional cart creaked along the narrow roads. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of unease. Even before she reached the bottom of the hill, the first whispers of gossip had begun to flutter through the air, carried from one neighbor to another like moths drawn to lamplight. It was said that Mrs. Withers, the baker's wife, had spotted someone lurking near the old stone wall at the far end of the village at dawn. A stranger, perhaps, or someone known moving in secrecy. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each report with methodical care, recognizing that truth often resided in fragments and half-recollections rather than in any single dramatic revelation. Descending the hill, she noted the signs left behind, not only in the soil, but in the faint impressions upon the foliage. Branches bent at unusual angles, crushed wildflowers, and small tufts of wool snagged on brambles. These details, trivial to the casual observer, formed a pattern to Miss Marple's trained eye. The path of a hurried flight, the repeated need to navigate obstacles, the quiet insistence that the person in question had not intended to be followed. At the base of the hill, she paused near the mouth of the narrow lane that led into the heart of the village. Here, the footprints faded into a muddled jumble, intersected by the ordinary foot traffic of the early villagers. Yet she was certain of one thing. Someone had passed through recently, and their trail was not entirely lost. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint but distinct sound of voices. Mrs. Larkins, the village postmistress, and her sister-in-law were deep in conversation near the corner shop. "Did you hear about it?" one whispered, glancing anxiously toward the hill. "They say something strange is happening up there, in the old fields. Footprints, they say. And last night, the lights." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, letting the conversation drift past her. She had long known the power of letting others reveal what they feared to say aloud. It often contained far more truth than the words themselves. She made a mental note to visit the postmistress later. Small observations from seemingly trivial villagers often illuminated the corners of the story that were invisible to everyone else. The old church spire rose above the cluster of cottages, its shadow stretching across the narrow lanes as if keeping watch over the unfolding events. Miss Marple's route took her past the vicarage, where Mr. Hargrove was already in his garden, fussing over the rose bushes with more intensity than the flowers deserved. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he called, a note of preoccupation in his voice. "Did you see the footprints on the hill? The children are convinced it's some specter of the past. They're frightened to go near the fields." Miss Marple smiled gently, letting a soft chuckle escape. Children always see more than adults care to admit. she replied, her gaze drifting toward the hill again. But sometimes, what frightens them is merely a shadow of reality, nothing more sinister than a fox or a stray dog. Yet even as she spoke, her mind catalogued the possibilities, weighing the ordinary against the extraordinary. A fox did not run in hurried zigzags with small tufts of wool caught on brambles. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made her way to the edge of the fields where the trail had become most ambiguous. She knelt, examining the soil with practiced care, and noted a curious detail. The prints seemed to have been made by someone wearing boots that were too large, suggesting either borrowed footwear or an attempt to disguise their identity. The heel impressions were slightly flattened at one edge, perhaps from a habitual limp or the result of an injury. And there, alongside the prints, was the faint trace of a scent. An earthy, almost metallic tang that reminded her of the clay from the old quarry at the village's outskirts. It was a detail easily overlooked, but one that, in Miss Marple's mind, carried significance beyond the simple passage of an individual across the land. The wind shifted, rustling the tall grasses and carrying with it a faint, unexpected sound, the sharp, metallic ring of a dropped object. Miss Marple rose to her feet, following the sound with careful steps. There, half buried in mud near a bramble, was a small pendant, twisted and scratched as though it had fallen in haste. It bore the emblem of the Holloway estate, a manor known in the village not only for its sprawling gardens, but also for the quiet whispers of secrets long buried. The pendant's presence here, distant from the estate and near the disturbed footprints, spoke volumes. Someone connected to Holloway had been on the hill, whether by choice or necessity, and the hurried nature of their passage suggested an urgency that demanded explanation. As she examined the pendant, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a movement at the far edge of the field. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, emerged from the cover of the hedgerows. His coat was dark, his steps deliberate, and his expression unreadable. He paused as he noticed her, then inclined his head in a faint, almost imperceptible gesture. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "I was hoping I might find someone on the hill. These matters are delicate." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. She recognized the careful control in his tone, the precision of his words, and the way he scanned the field behind her, as though ensuring nothing had been missed. In a village like this, even the smallest gestures spoke volumes, and nothing about him was accidental. "Delicate matters often reveal themselves most clearly in overlooked details," she replied smoothly, her gaze fixed on his face, but her mind cataloguing every nuance of his appearance. "And sometimes they appear exactly where no one expects them. You seem to be suggesting that something has occurred up here recently?" Her words were casual, but her intuition pressed forward like a compass needle, drawn to the hidden truths beneath the ordinary. The man's expression remained measured, but a faint crease appeared between his brows, a flicker of unease. "Indeed," he said carefully, "but it is best discussed where there are fewer interruptions. Perhaps the village hall?" Miss Marple noted the subtle attempt to control the narrative, the desire to relocate the conversation, and she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The truth, she mused, rarely required grand gestures to reveal itself. As they walked toward the village, the conversation shifted, careful at first, then revealing fragments, rumors of missing papers, of whispered threats in the late hours, of a disagreement that had unsettled more than one household. Miss Marple absorbed every word, cross-referencing the details with the observations she had made on the hill. Every footfall, every hesitation in speech, every glance toward the fields became part of a mosaic that only she could perceive fully. By the time they reached the village hall, she'd already begun to reconstruct the events that led someone to flee across Fallow Hill at dawn, leaving footprints as silent witnesses to the unfolding tension. Inside the hall, The air smelled faintly of varnish and dust, and the tall windows allowed sunlight to spill unevenly across the wooden floor. Here, removed from the distractions of the street and the prying eyes of the neighbors, Miss Marple could apply her quiet scrutiny with full effect. The man seated himself deliberately, maintaining a posture that suggested both control and concealed anxiety. "You will understand," he began, "that it is not merely gossip that has brought me here. There are implications that could affect the standing of several families, and—" Miss Marple held up a hand, interrupting him gently. "The standing of families is rarely the issue. It is the behavior of individuals, the choices made in a moment of urgency or fear that tell the story more honestly than any reputation ever could." Her words were soft, yet they carried the weight of authority that came from decades of observing human nature with both empathy and discernment. And as the morning stretched toward noon, the first threads of the mystery began to knit themselves together. Footprints, a discarded pendant, the careful avoidance of direct answers, all were pieces of a puzzle that, in the hands of someone less attentive, might have been lost. But Miss Marple's eyes missed nothing. Every nuance, every shadow, every hushed whisper was a clue leading toward a revelation that, though still distant, was now unmistakably within reach. Fallow Hill, with its rolling slopes and quiet village beneath, had already begun to speak, and Miss Marple was listening with the patience and precision that only she could command. In the silent, observing moments that followed, the day itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next step in a story that had only just begun to unfold. The afternoon sun cast long, golden shafts across the village streets, illuminating the uneven cobblestones and the neatly tended gardens with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension in Miss Marple's mind. She walked deliberately toward the Holloway estate, her shawl wrapped snugly against the cool breeze, noting the familiar sights that belied the subtle disturbances she had sensed that morning. Children ran in playful clusters, their laughter ringing lightly through the air, yet even in their carefree energy, she could detect the faintest signs of unease. A whispered comment here, a cautious glance there, as if the village itself had sensed the ripple of a hidden disturbance. Miss Marple moved with the quiet assurance of someone attuned to these currents, understanding that the ordinary motions of life often concealed extraordinary truths. The Holloway estate rose at the far end of the village, its stone facade softened by the ivy clinging stubbornly to the walls, and the sprawling gardens were meticulously kept, yet an air of subdued tension clung to the grounds. As she approached the main gate, she noticed a gardener hastily shoving tools into a shed, his eyes darting nervously toward the hedgerows. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod, acknowledging the man without speaking. Such reactions were never meaningless. They were threads in the tapestry of human behavior that, when properly observed, often revealed more than words ever could. Her gaze swept across the gravel drive, and she noticed faint scuff marks near the entrance that matched the hurried, uneven rhythm of the footprints she had traced on Fallow Hill earlier. Someone had arrived here in haste, or left just as quickly, leaving the estate itself implicated in the unfolding mystery. The heavy wooden doors of the house opened before she could reach them, revealing Mr. Edward Holloway, tall, impeccably dressed, but with the subtle stiffness of a man unused to being questioned. His eyes, sharp and measuring, gave nothing away, but Miss Marple's attention to nuance caught the brief flicker of concern when her name passed his lips. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, stepping aside to allow her entrance. "I trust you are well. I hope I did not keep you waiting." There was a careful cadence to his voice, each word selected to convey civility while masking apprehension. Miss Marple smiled faintly, noting the precision in his mannerisms. "I'm well, thank you. I wondered if you might shed some light on a matter that appears to have begun on Fallow Hill this morning," she replied, her tone casual but probing. "A few footprints, a pendant. Perhaps you know of them?" Mr. Holloway's eyes hardened slightly, though the gesture was almost imperceptible. "I cannot say that I do," he replied, though there was a hesitancy in his voice that did not escape her notice. "The estate is large. Many visitors come and go. You would understand, of course, that not every small occurrence reaches my attention." Yet even as he spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the room beyond, noting the small details that spoke volumes. A chair slightly askew, a sheet of paper pushed carelessly aside, the faint indentation of someone's fingerprints on the polished desk. These were the marks of someone in a hurry, someone preoccupied with something more pressing than polite socialities. She observed quietly, cataloguing each detail as though arranging a series of subtle clues into a larger picture. A faint sound, the soft scrape of leather against wood, drew her attention. From the study beyond came a young woman, her face pale, eyes wide with apprehension, and hands pressed nervously against the folds of her dress. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. The girl was clearly unsettled, and her posture, the way she avoided eye contact, indicated fear rather than casual discomfort. "You must be Miss Holloway," she said gently, inclining her head with the lightest of gestures. "I hope I am not intruding." The girl's lips parted as if to speak, but only a faint tremor of a sigh escaped. No, you are not," she managed, her voice barely audible. "It is just, everything has been unusual this morning." Miss Marple's smile was subtle but knowing. Unusual events were the precise circumstances in which truths were revealed, especially when observed by those too frightened to conceal them fully. The conversation moved cautiously at first, each party measuring words and tone, yet gradually the girl's unease began to unravel into fragments of information. She spoke of a visitor seen late at night, of muffled voices in the corridors, of papers hastily gathered and locked away. Her account was disjointed, punctuated by pauses and half-formed sentences, but Miss Marple listened with patient attention, aware that human memory, when frightened, often fractured the most relevant details, leaving behind hints that were clearer than any polished story. Every hesitation, every falter, and every repeated phrase formed part of a larger pattern, a rhythm of truth hidden within confusion. Miss Marple excused herself briefly to examine the room more thoroughly. Her eyes swept over the polished floorboards, noting a faint trail of mud that matched the prints from Fallow Hill. She bent to observe more closely and discovered a small fragment of fabric snagged in the corner of the rug. A light wool, similar to the tufts she had found along the hill. The fragment, though minor, spoke of a hurried passage, a moment of tension that had left tangible traces. When she returned to the young woman, she asked softly, "Has anyone else in the house been concerned recently? Perhaps someone who might have needed to leave in a hurry?" The girl hesitated, then nodded slightly, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "Yes, my brother. He didn't say where he was going, only that it was urgent." Miss Marple considered the implication carefully. The estate was vast, with multiple wings and servants' quarters, yet the hurried departure of a household member, combined with the evidence from the hill, suggested something more than domestic inconvenience. She asked about the nature of the urgency, but the girl could offer no explanation, only confirming that the tension had been palpable, the hurried movements apparent to anyone observing closely. Miss Marple made a subtle mental note. Urgency born of secrecy often indicated both fear and opportunity. The footprints on Fallow Hill, the pendant, the hasty movements within the estate, all were threads connected to a single concealed event, and she intended to unravel it without alarm. Her attention then turned to the staff. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the observations of those accustomed to routine often revealed inconsistencies invisible to the casual eye. The butler, who appeared calm and composed, bore a slight pallor at his temples, and his hands, though steady, betrayed an almost imperceptible tension as he poured tea. The cook, too, seemed flustered, glancing repeatedly toward the hallway as though expecting something or someone. Each Reaction was catalogued in her mind, a map of human behavior that pointed toward concealed knowledge, deliberate or otherwise. Even the minor details, such as a misplaced teaspoon or a chair turned at a subtle angle, were, in Miss Marple's eyes, pieces of a puzzle slowly assembling themselves into a larger design. By late afternoon, she had pieced together a preliminary sequence of events. A person, likely someone connected to the Holloway household, had departed the estate under unusual circumstances, leaving behind both physical evidence and a trail of human reactions that, when carefully examined, revealed the contours of a secret hurriedly concealed. The footprints on Fallow Hill, the pendant, the hints of anxiety among family members and staff, all converged to suggest that something significant, perhaps perilous, had occurred overnight. Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation that accompanied the first true understanding of a mystery. The knowledge that the story, once obscured, was now beginning to reveal its shape. She took a moment to step into the garden, where the sun was dipping lower, casting elongated shadows over the hedgerows. The fragrance of roses mingled with the earthy scent of the recently turned soil. Yet beneath this pastoral calm, Miss Marple detected the faint tension that had been present since the morning. Life in the village could continue in its routines, but for those attuned to subtle shifts, the quiet movements, the hurried footsteps, the faintest trace of panic, the day was anything but ordinary. Every sound, every movement, every glance could carry significance. And for Miss Marple, it was a reminder that even the most tranquil settings could conceal moments of profound consequence. She returned to the house where Edward Holloway awaited, and met his gaze with a quiet firmness. "The day has revealed much already," she said softly. "And yet there is more to uncover. The urgency, the footprints, the fragmented accounts, they all lead toward an event that is not yet fully visible." His posture stiffened slightly, and he nodded with measured acknowledgement. "I understand," he said cautiously. "I will provide whatever assistance I can." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. Assistance, she knew, often meant little more than revealing the truth through observation, patience, and the careful assembling of human behavior into a coherent narrative. As the shadows lengthened across the estate and the village beyond, Miss Marple felt the familiar, steady pulse of anticipation. The mystery, she realized, was no longer abstract. It had taken shape through the smallest traces, a footprint in mud, a thread of wool, a hesitant glance, and each fragment added weight to a developing picture. Fallow Hill had spoken once again, and those who had moved in secrecy would soon discover that its whispers were not so easily ignored. In the quiet moments that followed, she allowed herself a deep, measured breath, readying her mind for the next layer of discovery, certain that the day's events had already set the stage for revelations yet to come. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, with a chill that lingered in the air and made the damp earth of Fallow Hill seem even heavier underfoot. Miss Marple set out early, determined to revisit the hill and trace the footprints once more, for she knew that even the smallest alterations in the impressions could reveal new truths. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the lower slopes, curling around hedgerows and drifting in languid spirals across the tilled fields. Her shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning each indent, each smudge of mud, with the meticulous attention that had long distinguished her as an observer of human nature. Footprints, she reminded herself, were more than marks upon the earth. They were narratives in miniature. Each telltale curve of the heel, each uneven stride a reflection of the inner state of the person who had made them. As she descended the hill toward the area where the trail had become muddled the day before, she noted that the prints seemed fresher than she had expected. Overnight, a thin drizzle had fallen, softening the earth, yet the main impressions remained distinct, the outline of soles and the subtle twists of weight unmistakable. She knelt carefully, running a gloved finger along the deeper depressions, noting the uneven pressure that suggested a momentary stumble. Here, she mused, was someone moving in haste, but not recklessly, alert, cautious, yet compelled by urgency beyond reason. The direction of the footprints indicated a path toward the village's northern lane, rather than the estate itself, which suggested that the individual had left the Holloway grounds with deliberate intent, avoiding the main roads and anyone who might observe. Her contemplation was interrupted by a soft, uneven cough from the edge of the hedgerow. Miss Marple looked up to see a figure emerging slowly from the undergrowth. An older man, his coat patched and worn, his hands calloused, his eyes wary and calculating. It was Mr. Fenwick, the retired gamekeeper who had once overseen the Holloway estate. Though his role in village life had long been diminished, his knowledge of the land and its movements remained unmatched. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "I thought I might find you here. Strange business on the hill, isn't it?" She inclined her head, masking the satisfaction she felt at his timely appearance. "Indeed, Mr. Fenwick. You have seen something, I presume." He nodded slowly, glancing around as though ensuring no one else could overhear. "Aye. Someone passed through late last night. Barely a soul about, but the prints tell a tale if you know how to read 'em." Miss Marple's mind began to assemble the pieces with renewed vigor. The presence of Mr. Fenwick, combined with the footprints and the pendant she had found, suggested that the events of the past 24 hours were neither random nor isolated. Someone connected to Holloway, or perhaps to another household entirely, had been compelled to move under the cover of darkness. "Did you notice anything unusual about the person's gait, Mr. Fenwick?" she asked, kneeling again to study a particularly deep heel mark. A limp, perhaps, or an irregular stride. He studied the prints closely, shading his eyes against the faint light. "Aye, there's a weight shifted to the left heel more than the right. Could be old injury, could be deliberate misstep to confuse watchers. Hard to say. But the pace was hurried, desperate-like, that much I can be certain of." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thoughtful line. The patterns were beginning to coalesce into a clearer picture. Someone moving with both purpose and concealment, leaving clues that would draw attention only if the observer were both patient and perceptive. She rose, her eyes scanning the horizon toward the village. The northern lane, narrow and bordered by hedgerows, was already stirring with the early activities of villagers going about their daily routines. A cart rattled down the road, and a baker's boy carried a basket of fresh bread, calling greetings to neighbors. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were far from the ordinary scenes. She noted the careful avoidance of certain windows and the subtle sidelong glances exchanged by those who passed her on the lane. Anxiety, she understood, was infectious, and the residents' reactions often betrayed knowledge or suspicion long before a single word was spoken. She began to walk toward the village, accompanied by Mr. Fenwick, her mind cataloguing each movement, each faint sound, and each half-uttered remark as though they were letters forming a cryptic message. Their path led them past the small row of cottages closest to the northern lane. Mrs. Withers, the baker's wife, was at her gate, bustling about with more vigor than necessary, casting anxious glances down the lane as if expecting something or someone to appear. Miss Marple nodded politely, allowing a casual comment to elicit a reaction. "Good morning, Mrs. Withers. Has the night passed uneventfully?" The woman's hand paused mid-sweep of a doorstep, and her eyes widened just enough to betray surprise. "Oh, yes, of course, Miss Marple. Nothing unusual, I assure you." The brief lapse in composure was a spark for the seasoned observer. The truth, Miss Marple knew, often hid in these minuscule fractures of control. Further down the lane, she noticed the subtle disturbance of the earth near a small wooden gate leading into a garden. A narrow strip of churned soil suggested that someone had entered or exited in a hurried manner. brushing past the low hedge with sufficient force to bend several branches. Miss Marple crouched to examine the marks more closely. "These are recent," she murmured, more to herself than to Mr. Fenwick. "Someone has passed through here with the same urgency as the hill footprints. And see here, the small scratch on the gatepost, likely made by a bag or package carried in haste." The gamekeeper nodded gravely. "Aye, and whoever it was, they knew the lane well. Couldn't have happened by accident." Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a faint glimmer at the base of the gatepost. A small metallic object lay partially hidden in the damp grass. She retrieved it carefully. A locket, its surface scratched and dulled, but still bearing the same emblem as the pendant from the hill. Her pulse quickened subtly. Two related objects, found in such disparate locations, suggested a continuity of movement, a trail being inadvertently left by someone desperate or frightened. Whoever had carried these trinkets had traversed Fallow Hill and the northern lane with a purpose, yet the urgency of their movements had betrayed them in small but telling ways. As she rose, Miss Marple noticed a figure at the far end of the lane, partially obscured by the shadows of the tall hedgerows. A man, tall and deliberate, watched them with calm calculation. There was no need for words. The tension in his stance, the careful attention to their movements, was enough to convey his awareness. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the distance, the angle of observation, the lack of sudden movement, details that revealed someone experienced in surveillance, or at least cautious enough to avoid detection. The man's presence here, combined with the trail of hurried footprints and scattered evidence, suggested that the events unfolding were far more intricate than any simple village disturbance. Miss Marple and Mr. Fenwick continued along the lane, keeping the distant observer in view while examining the surroundings for further evidence. The further they walked, the more subtle signs emerged. Faint imprints in soft soil where someone had paused, a strand of dark thread snagged on a bramble, the subtle indentation of a boot on a step where grass had grown thin. Each detail was a note in a quiet, unfolding symphony, and Miss Marple's mind, attuned to such patterns, began to assemble them into a coherent narrative. The urgency, the secrecy, and the traces of human presence were converging toward an event that remained unseen, but whose outline was growing ever clearer. By the time they reached the small stone bridge at the lane's end, the observer had vanished, leaving only the whisper of movement among the reeds. Miss Marple paused, allowing the quiet of the late morning to wash over her. Even in absence, the man's presence lingered in the patterns he had left behind. The subtle avoidance of open spaces, the careful tracing of shadows, the apparent knowledge of the landscape's every contour. It was a reminder that human actions, deliberate or not, always left a trace, and that such traces, when observed patiently, revealed more than words ever could. Miss Marple crouched beside the bridge, her gloved hand brushing the damp soil, noting a small indentation that had not been visible from the lane. It was fresh, a final mark in the journey that had begun on Fallow Hill and continued through the northern lane. She rose, her eyes scanning the water's edge and the opposite bank, already constructing the possibilities of movement, concealment, and intention. The mystery, she realized, was growing more complex by the hour, with every fragment of evidence weaving into a tapestry that only the patient and perceptive could interpret. And in that quiet, tense moment, she knew with certainty that the day's discoveries were merely the beginning. The threads she had begun to follow would soon lead to truths that might disturb the village far more than the footprints themselves. The afternoon sun was beginning to wane, casting long, slanting shadows across the village streets when Miss Marple made her way toward the small inn that stood at the heart of Fallow Hill. Its weathered sign creaked in the breeze, and the scent of wood smoke and baking bread mingled in the cool air. Inside, a few villagers lingered over tea, their voices hushed but carrying a certain undercurrent of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple's presence drew glances, but none dared approach directly. They knew that she observed more than she revealed, and her reputation for discernment often left the uninitiated uneasy. She moved to a quiet corner, seating herself where she could see the entrance and the inn's narrow corridor, noting the faint scratches on the floor where chairs had been dragged recently, another subtle trace of human movement, perhaps unnoticed by anyone else, but entirely meaningful to her. Her attention was caught first by a man sitting near the fireplace, his coat slightly damp, his hat in hand, and the posture of someone accustomed to controlling appearances. He scanned the room periodically, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone or something. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. This was not casual concern, but deliberate observation, a small dance of calculation in a public setting. She allowed herself a quiet assessment, the angle of his shoulders, the stiffness of his fingers on the brim of his hat, the slight tightening of his jaw when another villager's gaze lingered too long. Each detail added weight to her suspicions that he had been involved in the movements across Fallow Hill and the Northern Lane, and perhaps more intimately connected to the mysterious events unfolding around the Holloway estate. The innkeeper, a portly man with a ruddy complexion, approached Miss Marple with a polite smile. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "I hear you've been up the hill this morning. Footprints, eh? Some curious business, that." His eyes flicked toward the man by the fireplace, betraying a measure of unease, even as he maintained his jovial tone. "Yes, indeed," she replied smoothly, her voice soft but firm. "And there seems to be more than mere footprints. Certain items have appeared, scattered along paths, in gardens, and indications of hurried movements. I wonder if you have noticed anything unusual last night." The innkeeper hesitated, a subtle crease forming across his forehead. "Well, there were noises. Nothing one could be certain of, mind you, but doors closing unexpectedly, a quick footfall here and there. The guests, they all remarked upon it, but I thought little of it at the time." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, filing away the details for careful comparison with her observations at the estate and on the hill. Her attention returned to the man by the fireplace, who now rose, moving with a cautious, deliberate air toward the far end of the room. Miss Marple noted the calculated spacing of his steps, the measured avoidance of any obstacle, and the faint trace of mud on his boots, almost invisible to anyone untrained. Her curiosity deepened. This man had crossed terrain recently disturbed by the same mysterious figure whose trail she had been following since dawn. She allowed herself a small, subtle shift of position, keeping him within her line of sight while pretending to examine her tea. The faint twitch of his gaze toward her did not escape her notice. He was aware of her scrutiny, and that awareness, she knew, could provoke subtle reactions that revealed more than words ever would. A soft commotion at the door drew attention for a moment, and a young woman entered, carrying a basket and wiping her hands on a cloth. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, settling for a brief second on the man near the fireplace, then darting to Miss Marple. There was a tension in her expression, a hesitation in her steps that suggested fear, or at least an urgent concern. Miss Marple's mind catalogued every detail, the slight tremor of her hands, the pace of her breathing, the careful manner in which she set the basket down on a nearby table. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said gently, inclining her head. "You seem to be in a hurry. Have you seen anything unusual in the village today?" The girl's lips parted, then pressed together again, as if measuring the words she dared to speak. I saw someone near the Northern Lane early this morning," she whispered finally, her voice trembling slightly. "They moved quickly, but they were careful, like they didn't want to be noticed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The Northern Lane had already yielded more than a few clues, the prints, the disturbed gate, the fragment of fabric, but the girl's account added a human dimension, a confirmation that someone had indeed been moving with deliberate caution. She inclined her head, encouraging the girl to continue. "Do you know who it might have been?" The young woman shook her head, casting a furtive glance. toward the man who had not yet left his corner. I couldn't tell, only that they carried something small, perhaps precious, and they seemed afraid, very afraid. The words, though simple, struck a chord with Miss Marple. Fear, she understood, was often the sharpest indicator of significance. It left traces invisible to the untrained eye, but evident to someone who observed patiently and without judgment. Miss Marple rose, her movements quiet but deliberate, and approached the man by the fireplace. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice soft yet imbued with authority. "I wonder if you might share your observations from this morning. The village has been unusually active, and there are several threads that require careful attention." The man straightened, a faint flush rising to his cheeks, and he regarded her with measured calculation. I've seen nothing unusual," he replied cautiously. "I arrived early, but the village seemed peaceful enough." Miss Marple allowed a faint smile, careful to keep her tone conversational. Peaceful, perhaps, to those unaware of small disturbances. Yet even a single hurried step, a brief glance, a piece of dropped jewelry can speak volumes. You may have overlooked such things, but they are, I assure you, meaningful. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "There was someone," he admitted at last, in a lower, cautious tone. "I saw them by the old gate on the northern lane. They carried something, a locket, I think. They moved quickly, and when they saw me, they hesitated, then continued on their way. I did not pursue. I had my reasons." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet comprehension. The confirmation of the locket, carried along the northern lane, matched the pendant found on Fallow Hill and the fragment discovered in the garden earlier. The continuity of these traces, combined with human observation, was beginning to form a coherent narrative. She gestured subtly for the girl with the basket to remain nearby, then asked the man to describe the figure further. "Tall, cloaked, careful of every movement," he said slowly, as though weighing the significance of each word. "I could not see the face. They avoided the open spaces, moving close to the hedgerows, and when they passed the bridge, they looked back, only briefly, but enough for me to sense. Fear, yes, but also determination." Miss Marple nodded, absorbing every detail. The juxtaposition of fear and determination suggested someone motivated by necessity, perhaps by urgency beyond the ordinary, yet unwilling to reveal their intent openly. A knock at the inn door drew attention, and the innkeeper went to answer. A boy, breathless, entered, holding a letter with a faint smudge of mud along its edge. "For Miss Marple," he said, placing it carefully on the table. She took it without comment, noting the seal, a familiar crest from the Holloway estate, faintly creased as though it had traveled with haste. Breaking the seal, she read the contents with measured attention, her eyes narrowing as each line confirmed suspicions she had begun to form. The letter spoke in careful, guarded language of disturbances at the estate, of missing items, of hurried departures and hidden intentions, but left gaps. Deliberate omissions meant to obscure as much as to inform. Even in its indirectness, it confirmed the connections she had already traced from hill to lane to inn. Miss Marple folded the letter, her mind assembling the network of movements, reactions, and evidence into a clearer picture. The patterns of haste, the objects left or carried, the careful attention to concealment, and the human observations all pointed toward a single thread of urgency and secrecy. The village, outwardly calm, had been the stage for movements deliberate and careful, and the traces, footprints, pendants, fragments of fabric, anxious glances, were now coalescing into a narrative that could be read by one patient and perceptive observer. As the shadows lengthened and the light softened into the subdued hues of late afternoon, Miss Marple rose, placing the letter carefully in her reticule. She looked around the inn one last time, noting the villagers' subtle reactions, The brief hesitation in conversation, the careful avoidance of certain eyes, the faint tremor in a hand passing a cup of tea. Each was a minor clue, yet together they formed the pulse of the village, a quiet testament to the undercurrent of tension running beneath its ordinary routines. She stepped toward the door, the cool air greeting her, and felt the familiar stir of anticipation that accompanied the moment when threads began to reveal their connections. The day had yielded further insight. Movements were traced, intentions hinted, and the presence of fear, determination, and secrecy was confirmed. The story, she realized, was becoming increasingly intricate, yet it was one she was fully prepared to unravel, step by careful step, guided by the quiet, revealing traces of human behavior. The sky had shifted to a pale, steely gray by mid-morning, the kind of light that flattened contours and dulled color, yet Miss Marple found it perfect for careful observation. She walked along the lane leading from the inn toward the outskirts of the village, her eyes scanning every patch of disturbed earth, every bent branch, every trace of movement that might have escaped casual notice. The village itself appeared serene, but in the subtleties, the half-hidden glance of a child watching from a doorway, the slight hesitation of a woman carrying a basket, she detected the persistent ripple of unease that had grown steadily over the past days. Fallow Hill and its surrounding paths had begun to whisper their secrets, and she intended to listen with patience and precision. As she approached the intersection where the northern lane branched toward the meadows, she noted a small crowd gathered near a low stone wall. Villagers murmured in quiet tones, gesturing toward the ground. Kneeling carefully beside them, she saw what had drawn their attention: a series of fresh, shallow footprints, smaller than those she had examined previously, but moving with a similar urgency and irregularity. She crouched to inspect them more closely, noting the uneven pressure of the heels, the scattered impressions where the individual had stumbled or shifted direction, and a faint streak of clay embedded in the tread. These were not casual steps. They were deliberate, hurried and yet cautious, a signature she had come to recognize over the course of her observations. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Marple." It was Mr. Fenwick, who had joined her once more, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You'll want to see this. There's something else near the hedgerow." Together, they moved toward the overgrown boundary, where the soil bore signs of disturbance. A small, torn piece of fabric protruded from the earth, dark and fibrous, twisted by its snag on a thorn. Miss Marple extracted it carefully, noting the similarity to the tufts of wool she had observed both on Fallow Hill and near the Holloway estate. Each fragment, each small clue, formed a continuous chain, a narrative of movement that extended further than anyone had imagined, and yet still demanded patient interpretation to reveal its purpose. While she examined the fragment, a faint rustle in the hedgerow drew her gaze. A man emerged, slightly hunched, with careful steps and alert eyes, pausing as if calculating whether to continue. Miss Marple's mind catalogued his posture, the angle of his shoulders, the slight unevenness in his gait. Subtle markers of someone accustomed to moving with caution, yet mindful of observation. The man's eyes swept the lane and the crowd of villagers, lingering briefly on her with a look that suggested awareness, but not recognition. Miss Marple allowed a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that she had noticed him, and he moved on, disappearing into the labyrinth of paths and hedgerows beyond. Every presence, every reaction was part of a larger story. Even a fleeting glimpse could illuminate patterns invisible to the casual eye. The murmuring of the villagers drew her attention back to the footprints. She followed the trail along the edge of the field, noting how the ground bore the subtle depressions of hurried movement. At one point, the prints curved sharply toward a shallow ditch, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint trace of clay smeared along a tuft of grass, suggesting a brief stumble. "Someone has been careful," she murmured to Mr. Fenwick, "but the earth always records what the eye might miss. Even the most practiced caution leaves a whisper behind." The gamekeeper nodded, acknowledging the observation, and together they traced the path toward a small copse of trees where the footprints vanished into thicker undergrowth. A sudden commotion drew their attention to the copse itself. From the shadows emerged a young boy, his face flushed, his hands gripping a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. "I saw someone drop this," he exclaimed breathlessly, holding it out for Miss Marple. She accepted it gently, noting the slight tremor in his hands. The parcel was modest in size, yet its weight suggested something more than ordinary. It carried a faint metallic clink when shifted. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a second locket, similar in design to the pendant she had found on Fallow Hill and the fragment near the hedgerow. Her mind worked swiftly, connecting the continuity of these objects, the path of footprints, and the subtle reactions of those who had witnessed the movements. The narrative of urgency, secrecy, and careful concealment was becoming more pronounced with each discovery. Miss Marple rose, holding the locket in her gloved hand, and looked across the copse to the lane beyond. There, partially hidden by a wall of trees, she caught a figure standing still, watching. The posture was calm, but the fingers tightened around an unseen object, betraying tension. It was clear this observer was aware that their movements had been noted, and that the small network of traces she had gathered had begun to reveal patterns they had hoped to conceal. She returned her attention to Mr. Fenwick and the boy. "They are careful," she said softly, "but not careful enough to prevent the story from leaving marks. Every step, every gesture, every fragment tells us something, and the full picture is beginning to emerge." The boy pointed toward the path he had seen the individual take. "They went that way," he said, "into the lower meadows." Miss Marple considered the direction thoughtfully. The meadows were bordered by hedgerows, uneven earth, and several small streams, a natural maze for anyone seeking to obscure their passage. Yet in each of these landscapes, she knew, the earth would retain memory, and the human presence would leave signs. She followed the boy's indication, examining the soil at each step. Small depressions in the mud, broken twigs, and faint traces of fabric confirmed the direction, reinforcing the narrative she was assembling piece by piece. As they approached a narrow bridge over a shallow stream, she paused. The water had partially washed away the soil, yet faint marks on the muddy banks suggested that the individual had taken care to avoid stepping fully into the stream, using the edges and stones as a path. Miss Marple knelt, examining the impressions closely. Even under pressure, she murmured to Mr. Fenwick, "People cannot entirely erase their movements. Fear, urgency, and intention are all recorded here in the earth. One could almost read the emotions as plainly as the footprints themselves." The gamekeeper, accustomed to the ways of the land, nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the area for further evidence, though Miss Marple's trained vision detected more than he acknowledged. Beyond the stream, the trail led into a narrow thicket that opened into a small clearing. Here, the ground bore the evidence of a brief pause. Prints clustered in a tight circle, slightly deeper than elsewhere, suggesting someone had knelt or crouched. Miss Marple studied the arrangement carefully, noting the subtle smears of clay and traces of fabric that had caught on the surrounding brambles. This was no ordinary stop. It was deliberate, an action with purpose, yet hurried, as though the individual feared discovery, even in this secluded spot. She crouched to inspect the scene further, noting a faint impression of something dropped, perhaps a key or small instrument, which would later provide another clue in understanding the sequence of events. From the edge of the clearing, the faint sound of movement reached her ears. Leaves rustling, twigs snapping under careful feet. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes scanning the perimeter. There, at the far boundary of the clearing, a figure emerged, hesitant, glancing both ways, moving with the same careful urgency she had observed all morning. It was clear this person was connected to the objects and the trail of footprints, yet the exact nature of their involvement remained concealed beneath layers of caution and secrecy. Miss Marple's mind catalogued every detail, the angle of observation, the tilt of the head, the measured steps, all of which formed pieces of the puzzle she was slowly assembling into a coherent whole. She straightened, addressing Mr. Fenwick quietly. "The evidence is consistent," she said. "A sequence of actions, each deliberate, each cautious, yet all leaving traces. Footprints, objects, reactions. Together they tell us that whatever has occurred here involves urgency, secrecy, and perhaps fear. We are close to understanding the full movement, though the reason behind it remains hidden." Her words were soft, but imbued with certainty. The day's discoveries had confirmed the continuity of the trail, and the human behaviors intertwined with it had provided subtle confirmation that the events were far more intricate than any ordinary village occurrence. As the afternoon deepened, Miss Marple observed the clearing in silence, taking in the faint traces left in the soil, the scattered brambles, and the subtle shifts of light and shadow. Every detail was a fragment of a story that had begun on Fallow Hill and continued through northern lanes, hedgerows, and meadows. In the quiet, attentive moments that followed, she felt the familiar stir of anticipation, the certainty that the evidence, when fully interpreted, would reveal intentions, connections, and perhaps even the secret fears driving these carefully concealed movements. The puzzle, piece by piece, was becoming whole, and the narrative of urgency and human behavior was beginning to speak clearly. The early morning mist still clung to the edges of Fallow Hill, curling around the hedgerows and softening the contours of the village below, as Miss Marple set out once more, her senses alert to even the slightest disturbance in the landscape. She moved along the familiar path, her steps measured, eyes scanning the soil and undergrowth with patient precision. The recent days had left a complex network of traces, each demanding careful attention, and she intended to follow them to their natural conclusion. The footprints, fragments of fabric, and small objects discovered in the hill, lanes, and meadows were not isolated. They were connected, forming a pattern that hinted at both urgency and secrecy. And the subtle movements of those involved were now beginning to coalesce into a story she could read with the trained eyes of experience. As she reached the edge of the northern lane, the familiar churn of soft soil beneath her boots reminded her of the hurried passage she had traced the day before. She paused, examining a cluster of footprints that diverged slightly from the main path, suggesting a deliberate deviation. A small indentation on a nearby stone indicated that someone had paused, perhaps to check their surroundings or retrieve an object, leaving a faint mark that was all but invisible to a casual observer. Miss Marple knelt carefully, noting the angle of the footprints, the depth of the impressions, and the subtle smears of earth and clay along the edges. The minutiae of movement were the language of intent, and she read it fluently. Someone had acted with both caution and purpose, constrained by urgency, but careful not to attract attention. A faint sound drew her gaze toward a cottage along the lane. Curtains twitched, and a woman's head peeked out, eyes wide, a subtle frown of worry creasing her brow. Miss Marple acknowledged her with a small nod, noting the slight tension in the woman's shoulders and the rapid blinking of her eyes. Signals of anxiety that betrayed knowledge she did not dare voice. Even without words, these reactions were telling, part of the mosaic of human behavior that Miss Marple relied upon to illuminate what remained hidden. She continued along the lane, her attention divided between the trail of footprints and the people who inhabited the spaces the footprints traversed, aware that the interplay between physical traces and human observation often revealed more than either alone. As she approached a fork in the path, she noticed fresh marks along the verge. Narrow, deliberate depressions that suggested someone carrying a small but weighted object, the soil compressed unevenly under the strain. Nearby, a torn fragment of dark fabric caught on a thorn, fluttering faintly in the breeze. Miss Marple picked it up, noting its texture and color, familiar from the fragments she had already collected from Fallow Hill, the northern lane, and the clearing in the meadows. Each discovery reinforced the continuity of movement, the persistence of a narrative that involved deliberate action, careful concealment, and an unspoken urgency that seemed to drive every step. A sudden rustle from the hedgerow drew her attention to a figure emerging cautiously from the shadows. The man, mid-30s perhaps, moved with controlled precision, eyes sweeping the lane and surrounding area as if calculating the risk of exposure. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief, subtle assessment. The angle of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the way his feet lifted and placed themselves with measured care, all spoke of someone accustomed to surveillance or evasion. The presence of this observer added a new dimension to her understanding. The individual she had been tracking was aware that others were watching, or at least the possibility, and had adapted movements accordingly, leaving a trail both deliberate and revealing. She paused near a small stone wall bordering a field, kneeling to examine a narrow gap where footprints indicated a careful climb or step. The earth bore faint impressions of gloves, of fingers pressed against the stone to steady balance, and a small scrape suggested that a package or bundle had been held close while ascending. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each detail, constructing a narrative from movement alone. The urgency, the concealment, and the careful attention to every obstacle. These were not the actions of someone careless. They were the deliberate movements of an individual seeking to achieve an objective while minimizing exposure. The consistency of movement, the repeated attention to concealment, reinforced the emerging understanding of motivation and intent. From the distance came the faint sound of footsteps moving across uneven earth. Miss Marple rose slowly, shading her eyes against the pale light. A boy appeared, running lightly along the lane, glancing frequently over his shoulder, clutching something pressed to his chest. "Miss Marple," he called breathlessly, coming to a halt. I saw someone hide something in the hedgerow last night. They moved fast, and I didn't follow, but..." His words trailed off, and Miss Marple inclined her head encouragingly. "You did exactly right to wait. Can you show me where?" The boy nodded and led her along the edge of the lane, pointing to a small depression concealed beneath low branches. She knelt, brushing aside leaves and loose twigs, to uncover a small leather pouch. Inside, she found another locket, its surface scratched and dulled, but unmistakably part of the sequence she had been following from Fallow Hill to the northern lane and beyond. Miss Marple held the locket delicately, weighing the significance of its placement. Each successive item, each carefully concealed object, provided insight into the intentions of the person responsible. There was a method to these actions, she realized, a deliberate layering of evidence and misdirection. The repeated urgency combined with careful concealment suggested someone operating under pressure, yet guided by a strong sense of purpose. The locket was not lost or abandoned. It had been placed with intent, a marker in a chain of movements that spoke of planning and an awareness of observation. She rose, scanning the surrounding hedgerows and the paths that led deeper into the fields. Faint disturbances in the soil indicated that the individual had continued onward, moving cautiously, but with resolve. Miss Marple followed the subtle trail, noting the variations in depth and spacing of the prints, the occasional disruption of earth caused by branches or uneven ground. Each nuance revealed both physical and psychological states, haste, care, fear, and determination interwoven in each step. The evidence was no longer isolated. It had become a living map, illustrating a journey taken with both purpose and trepidation. As the trail curved toward a secluded copse near the edge of the village, a sudden movement caught her eye. A man, partially obscured by the trees, paused, glancing back in a manner that suggested both calculation and hesitation. Miss Marple's mind registered the subtle clues, the slight unevenness of his gait, the way his head tilted, the brief tension in his shoulders. This was the same vigilance, the same careful observation that had been evident in the others she had encountered along the lane. Whoever this person was, he was connected to the movements she had traced, and his presence confirmed that the events unfolding were neither casual nor random. She knelt briefly to examine the ground where he had paused, noting a small indentation consistent with someone holding an object in one hand while supporting themselves with the other. The soil bore faint streaks of clay, evidence of brief contact with the earth, and a fragment of fabric caught on a low branch added confirmation. These subtle marks, though easily overlooked, were rich with information. The methodical progression, the concealment of objects, the deliberate care in movement, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated sequence of actions, undertaken with both urgency and discretion. Miss Marple rose, observing the copse in silence, considering the full narrative that had emerged from hill to lane to meadow to this point. The continuity of evidence was undeniable, each step and each object forming a pattern that revealed not only movement, but intention, not only haste, but a measure of fear interlaced with determination. The human presence, in combination with the tangible traces left in soil, foliage, and hidden objects, had created a story that, while incomplete, was becoming increasingly coherent. She allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The mystery was no longer abstract. The pieces were aligning, and with patience, careful observation, and continued attention, the sequence of events and the motivations behind them would soon be fully understood. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting a muted amber light across the village, when Miss Marple made her way along the familiar northern lane. Her mind focused on the sequence of events she had traced over the past days. The path was quieter now, the early bustle of the villages replaced by the subtle sounds of birdsong and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Yet the calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface, the remnants of hurried footsteps, disturbed soil, and scattered fragments still whispered their quiet testimony. Miss Marple walked slowly, each step deliberate, her eyes sweeping the ground and the hedgerows for evidence that might otherwise go unnoticed. As she approached a narrow bend in the lane, she noticed a faint indentation in the soil, partially obscured by fallen leaves and small twigs. Kneeling, she traced the contour of the footprint, noting its depth, the uneven pressure, and a subtle twist of the heel that suggested a momentary stumble. The pattern matched the hurried gait she'd observed previously, but here there was something more. A slight drag of the sole along the soft earth, as if the individual had been attempting to maintain balance while carrying a small weighted object. She allowed her gloved fingers to brush over the impression, committing each detail to memory. Movement, she reflected, often revealed more than words, and these traces were beginning to speak clearly of fear, purpose, and deliberate concealment. A rustling sound drew her attention to the edge of the hedgerow. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as a figure emerged from the undergrowth. The man was tall, his coat dark, and his movements precise and careful, as if he were accustomed to being unseen. He paused at the lane's edge, scanning both directions, then appeared to hesitate before moving along a parallel path that skirted the lane. Miss Marple's mind catalogued his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the careful placement of his feet. Every detail suggested awareness and vigilance. This was no ordinary passerby, but someone deeply involved in the sequence of events she had been following. She continued along the lane, noting the subtle marks left by his passage, disturbed soil, bent branches, and occasional indentations where his hands or belongings had brushed against the foliage. Each fragment of evidence was consistent with the trail she had been piecing together from Fallow Hill, the northern lane, and the meadows beyond. The continuity was undeniable, and the narrative was becoming clearer. Someone was moving deliberately, with urgency, and yet with great care to conceal both their path and their purpose. Miss Marple's trained eye could read these traces as readily as a map, revealing the steps taken, the hesitations, and the careful planning behind each movement. As she rounded the bend, she spotted a small group of villagers gathered near the base of a low stone wall. Their conversation was hushed, their gestures tentative as if they feared drawing attention. Miss Marple approached quietly, allowing herself to appear casual while observing their reactions. One of the women, noticing her presence, straightened abruptly, her fingers brushing nervously against her apron. "Miss Marple," she said, voice trembling slightly. I saw someone running this morning past the hedge. They didn't want anyone to see them." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she prompted gently. "Did you notice what they were carrying?" The woman hesitated, then whispered, "Something. A small package, I think." They moved quickly, and when they passed the bridge, they looked around, frightened but determined. The description aligned precisely with the trail she had been following. The footprints, the fragments of fabric, and the various items discovered along the way. Each new detail added depth to the narrative, revealing not only movement, but intention, urgency, and an underlying fear that had driven the actions of the individual in question. Miss Marple made a subtle note of the villagers' reactions as well. Their careful phrasing, the brief glances toward the lane, the slight hesitation in their movements. All evidence of an awareness that extended beyond physical traces. Human behavior, as she had long observed, often amplified the truth hidden in the tangible clues. She continued along the lane, her attention now drawn to a narrow stream that ran parallel to the path. The banks were soft and muddy, and here the footprints revealed an unusual care in placement, with each step avoiding the water's edge where mud would cling. Miss Marple knelt to examine a particularly deep impression near a stone, noting the drag of a heel and a faint smear of clay along the side. It was clear the individual had been conscious of leaving as few traces as possible, yet the soil had recorded each motion faithfully. Even the smallest hesitations and adjustments, the subtle shifts in weight, the brief pause to steady a bundle, were etched into the ground, forming a continuous, readable story. A sudden movement in the undergrowth caught her attention, and she turned sharply. A young boy appeared, carrying something wrapped carefully in cloth, his breath quick, his eyes wide with apprehension. "Miss Marple," he called, coming to a halt. I found this near the old hedge. I didn't touch it until you came." She took the bundle gently, noting its weight and the care with which the boy had handled it. Unwrapping it revealed another small locket, familiar in design to the pendant found on Fallow Hill and the fragments along the northern lane and in the meadows. The continuity was undeniable. Each object reinforced the path she had been tracing, and each revealed a deliberate effort to move, conceal, and protect. She studied the locket for a moment, turning it in her hands. Its surface bore scratches and faint marks, suggesting hurried handling and contact with rough surfaces. This, combined with the careful concealment along the trail, indicated a plan both meticulous and urgent, executed under conditions of stress or fear. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly to integrate this evidence with her previous observations. Footprints, fabric fragments, disturbed earth, and the villagers' accounts of glimpsed figures. Each element contributed to a narrative that was becoming increasingly coherent, revealing the movements, motivations, and pressures driving the individual involved. Rising, she observed the surrounding area. The hedgerows and undergrowth provided natural cover, yet there were small gaps where light pierced through, revealing the careful choices made in navigating the landscape. The individual had used the terrain deliberately, moving along concealed paths, avoiding exposure, yet leaving enough trace for an attentive observer to follow. Miss Marple's eyes traced the line of movement, noting each subtle shift in direction, each point where the soil indicated hesitation, and each place where items had been left behind. These were deliberate acts, laden with meaning, each contributing to a larger, unfolding story. Her attention was drawn to a faint shadow moving at the edge of the lane. A figure emerged cautiously from the hedgerow, glancing first toward the path, then back toward the copse where the trail had begun. The man's movements were controlled, precise, revealing awareness of observation, but also a measure of caution that suggested concern over discovery. Miss Marple catalogued his posture, the tension in his hands, the careful placement of his feet, noting the subtle signals of vigilance and anxiety. Every aspect of his behavior, combined with the trail she had followed for days, reinforced the understanding that the events were neither random nor casual, but part of a deliberate, urgent sequence of actions. She moved closer to the stream, where the trail turned back toward the hedgerows and the far edge of the meadow. The soil bore fresh impressions of boots, deeper here than elsewhere, indicating a sudden increase in haste. Miss Marple examined a small tuft of wool caught on a bramble, noting its similarity to previous fragments. Each item, each footprint, each human observation coalesced into a continuous story, revealing both the method and urgency behind the movements she had traced. She allowed herself a quiet breath, recognizing that the pattern was becoming clear. Fear, determination, and secrecy intertwined in deliberate, observable ways. Pausing at the edge of the meadow, she surveyed the area one last time, taking in the subtle disturbances in the earth, the faint shadows, and the traces of hurried movement. The continuity of evidence, from Fallow Hill to the northern lane to the meadows, to this point was undeniable, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation that accompanied the near-complete assembly of a complex puzzle. The story of urgency, secrecy, and human intent was now visible, written not only in the earth and objects, but in the subtle reactions of those who had witnessed or participated. Each step had brought her closer to understanding, and she knew that with patience and careful observation, the full truth would soon be revealed. The late morning air was crisp, tinged with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves as Miss Marple made her way along the winding paths of Fallow Hill, her eyes attuned to the faintest disturbances in the soil and undergrowth. The trail she had been following for days had become a complex tapestry of footprints, fragments of fabric, and small objects, each piece contributing to a narrative that was gradually revealing itself. The village below appeared serene under the soft light, yet Miss Marple knew that the stillness was deceptive. Every shadow, every glance from behind a window, every hesitant movement along the paths told its own story, a silent accompaniment to the tangible traces she had already collected. As she approached the northern lane, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot echoed her measured steps. She paused to examine a cluster of footprints that had partially merged with the soil churned by morning rain. The impressions were deeper here, suggesting a pause, a moment of careful consideration. Miss Marple crouched, tracing the contours with a gloved finger, noting the uneven weight distribution and the faint smudge of clay along the edges. It was clear that the individual had carried a small but weighted object, adjusting their balance with each step. The details spoke of deliberate caution, an awareness of observation, and a subtle urgency that had guided each motion. A sudden movement at the edge of the hedgerow drew her gaze. A man emerged cautiously, his coat dark, his stance deliberate. He paused, scanning the lane and the surrounding area, then moved along a narrow path that skirted the edge of the road. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the careful placement of his feet, the slight tension in his shoulders, and the angle of his head as he surveyed the terrain. Every detail suggested vigilance, experience in moving without drawing attention, and a clear awareness of potential witnesses. The presence of this observer added a new dimension to the narrative she had been tracing, confirming that the individual responsible for the movements had been mindful of being followed, yet had left traces nonetheless. Continuing along the lane, she noticed a small indentation near a stone wall where the individual had paused, perhaps to rest or to conceal something. The soil bore faint marks of gloves, the slight drag of a heel, and a smear of clay, all indicating careful, yet hurried action. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each mark, constructing a picture of someone acting under pressure, but with methodical precision. The continuity of these movements with the earlier trail, from Fallow Hill to the meadows, suggested a deliberate route designed to avoid observation while allowing for brief stops to adjust or hide objects. Each nuance was a chapter in a story written across the earth, a narrative that only a patient observer could read. A soft rustle brought her attention to a young boy emerging from the undergrowth, clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, breathless. I found this near the old hedge. I didn't touch it, I promise." She accepted the parcel, noting its weight and the care with which it had been handled. Inside was another locket, its surface scratched but unmistakably part of the sequence she had been tracing. The pattern was now undeniable. The pendants, the fabric fragments, and the disturbed earth all formed a coherent chain of deliberate movements, each step recorded in the soil and in human observation. The continuity reinforced the narrative she had been piecing together, revealing a deliberate, cautious progression across the village and its outskirts. She rose, examining the surrounding hedgerows and paths. Small gaps in the foliage, bent branches, and faint depressions indicated the careful choices made in navigation. The individual had avoided open spaces where exposure was more likely, moving instead through concealed areas, yet the earth had faithfully recorded each step. Miss Marple noted the variations in the footprints, sudden pauses, minor shifts in direction, and subtle changes in depth, all evidence of hesitations, adjustments, and urgent deliberation. Each mark revealed both physical and psychological states, painting a vivid picture of someone acting under stress, aware of being followed, yet resolute in their objective. The trail led her toward a small copse at the edge of the lane, where the soil bore the impressions of hurried movement. Here, the footprints formed a tight cluster, suggesting a brief pause or adjustment. Miss Marple knelt to examine them closely, noting a faint smear of clay and a tuft of dark fabric caught on a low branch. The combination of hurried movement and careful concealment spoke of someone intent on protecting the objects they carried, yet anxious about discovery. She catalogued each detail, understanding that these small traces, when interpreted together, revealed not only the route taken, but the mindset of the person responsible. From the edge of the copse came the faint sound of movement, a snapping twig, a subtle shift in leaves. A figure appeared, partially obscured by the trees, pausing to glance back toward the lane. The posture was tense, cautious, every motion deliberate. Miss Marple observed the angle of the head, the tension in the shoulders, and the careful placement of the feet. This was the same vigilance she had noted in others along the trail, confirming that the events were orchestrated, the movements deliberate, and the risk of discovery perceived keenly. The continuity of behavior, combined with a sequence of physical traces, painted a detailed picture of careful navigation under pressure. She continued along the edge of the meadow, noting the soft impressions in the soil where the individual had adjusted their balance or shifted the weight of the object they carried. The footprints grew deeper in places, indicating an increase in urgency or perhaps fatigue. Miss Marple examined a small stone that bore scratches consistent with contact from a metal object, likely part of the items she had collected. Each detail added texture to the story, revealing not only where the individual had traveled, but how they had interacted with the environment, adjusting their movements to obstacles, maintaining balance, and concealing their actions wherever possible. A faint sound of conversation drew her attention to a small group of villagers gathered near a low hedge. They exchanged glances and gestures, their voices low and cautious. Miss Marple approached, noting their subtle reactions. The quick blink, the hesitant hand gesture, the careful avoidance of certain eyes. "Good morning," she said gently, inclining her head. "Have you noticed anything unusual along the lane today?" One of the women glanced nervously around before replying. "I saw someone moving past the hedgerow early this morning. They carried something small, a package perhaps, and seemed..." worried. They moved quickly but looked back often as if afraid of being seen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, cataloguing the observation. The description aligned precisely with the physical trail she had been following. The footprints, the smears of clay, the fragments of fabric, and the scattered items. The combination of human testimony and tangible evidence provided a fuller understanding of the events. Fear and determination, careful planning and urgency were all encoded in the movements and objects, and the villagers' reactions confirmed that the presence of these traces had not gone unnoticed. She resumed her walk along the lane, moving toward a small wooden bridge spanning a shallow stream. The banks were soft and muddy, and here the footprints indicated extreme care, each step placed to avoid the water, yet leaving a subtle imprint where the soil had given way under weight. Miss Marple knelt, noting the drag of a heel along a stone and a faint smear of clay that suggested contact with the stream bed. Every hesitation, adjustment, and careful placement of feet added clarity to the narrative. The individual's movements were deliberate, constrained by urgency, and yet leaving a sequence of observable traces that spoke volumes about intent, caution, and fear. Beyond the bridge, the trail curved toward a small grove of trees. The soil bore fresh impressions, deeper here than in the preceding areas, indicating a sudden increase in haste or perhaps a momentary rush to conceal the items carried. Miss Marple observed the faint disturbance of foliage and broken twigs, noting the consistent method of concealment and the careful selection of paths through which to move. Each detail reinforced the continuity she had been tracing, from Fallow Hill to the northern lane, across the meadows, and now to this secluded grove. The story of deliberate, cautious, and urgent movement was unfolding with remarkable clarity, and the subtle human reactions observed throughout the village provided additional confirmation of its veracity. Pausing at the edge of the grove, Miss Marple surveyed the surrounding terrain. The footprints, fragments of fabric, disturbed earth, and scattered objects formed a coherent narrative of movement, intent, and secrecy. The sequence of events was no longer fragmented. It was a continuous story, written in soil, foliage, and human behavior. The evidence revealed not only where the individual had traveled, but also the careful attention to concealment, the urgency that drove each step, and the underlying tension that had dictated their path. She allowed herself a quiet moment to consider the full picture. The chain of actions was deliberate, cautious, and filled with purpose, and with continued observation, the motivations behind these movements would soon become clear. The morning mist hung low over Fallow Hill, softening the outlines of hedgerows and the distant cottages, but Miss Marple's eyes penetrated the haze with practiced precision. Each footprint she encountered, each disturbed patch of earth or bent twig, told a story she could read as easily as a letter on a page. The trail had now become more intricate than ever, a web of urgency, concealment, and subtle human intention stretching from the northern lane through the meadows and back toward the outskirts of the village. As she moved along the familiar path, she noted how the soil had recorded every step, every hesitation, and every adjustment in balance, a silent testimony to movements undertaken with purpose, yet constrained by caution. Near the edge of a small copse, she paused to examine a series of footprints that converged in a tight cluster. The impressions were deeper here, suggesting someone had paused to hide or retrieve an object, perhaps even to consider the next phase of their journey. Miss Marple crouched to inspect them closely, noting faint smears of clay and tufts of fabric snagged on the low branches. Each detail aligned with previous discoveries. Fragments from Fallow Hill, the northern lane, and the meadows now forming a coherent narrative. The careful, deliberate actions indicated both urgency and calculation, as if the individual had been aware of surveillance, yet determined to complete their purpose. A sudden movement in the undergrowth caught her attention, and a figure stepped into view, partially hidden by the foliage. The man moved with deliberate care, scanning the clearing and then the lane beyond, before continuing along a narrow path that hugged the edge of the copse. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, cataloguing the subtle tension in his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the measured pace of his feet. Every movement suggested vigilance and experience, a practiced awareness of potential observers. He left a trail, a light smear of mud along the hem of his coat, slight disturbances in the soil, and a faint drag of a leather-bound package against a stone. Each mark, though seemingly minor, added another layer to the unfolding story. The trail led her toward a small wooden bridge spanning a shallow stream, the banks softened by recent rain. Here the footprints were shallow but deliberate, careful to avoid slipping into the water, yet bearing the unmistakable sign of burdened movement. Miss Marple knelt to study the impressions, noting the uneven weight distribution and the faint streaks of clay along the edges. The person responsible had acted with meticulous care, every step both purposeful and cautious, revealing a mixture of fear and determination. She straightened, scanning the surrounding hedgerows for any additional clues, noting the slight bending of branches and scattered leaves that marked the individual's careful navigation of the terrain. From the far side of the bridge, a subtle sound drew her attention. A young boy emerged, breathless, holding a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "Miss Marple," he called, eyes wide, I saw this lying near the hedge. I didn't touch it." She took the bundle gently, noting the care with which it had been handled. Inside was another locket, scratched and dulled with use, but unmistakably part of the same sequence of objects she had been tracing since Fallow Hill. Each discovery reinforced the narrative: deliberate movements, careful concealment, and the persistent urgency that had driven the individual across the village landscape. She continued along the lane, observing the soft impressions left in the soil where the individual had adjusted their balance or shifted the weight of the objects they carried. The prints deepened at points, suggesting brief moments of hesitation or increased urgency, and the surrounding foliage bore subtle traces of contact: bent twigs, scattered leaves, and small smears of clay. Miss Marple catalogued each observation, aware that these details, when combined with the objects and eyewitness accounts, formed a detailed map of movement and intent. The trail was more than a series of steps. It was a narrative of careful planning executed under conditions of pressure and fear. As she rounded a bend, she spotted a faint shadow among the trees. A figure emerged cautiously from the hedgerow, pausing to glance toward the lane before moving along a concealed path into the copse. Miss Marple observed the angle of the head, the tension in the shoulders, and the measured pace of the feet. This person's vigilance mirrored the careful movements she had documented along the northern lane and the meadows, confirming that the events were deliberate, orchestrated, and guided by a clear objective: the continuity of behavior. Combined with the evidence of footprints and objects, created a cohesive story of cautious but purposeful action. Near the center of the copse, the soil bore a series of fresh impressions in a tight circle, indicating a brief pause. Miss Marple crouched to inspect the scene. Faint smears of clay, tufts of dark fabric caught on low branches, and subtle depressions suggesting someone had knelt or adjusted a package. The deliberate positioning and careful concealment reinforced the pattern she had been observing: an individual moving under duress, yet exercising meticulous control over their actions. Each nuance revealed both physical effort and psychological state, painting a vivid picture of determination intertwined with caution. A sudden sound of movement brought her attention to the edge of the clearing. Another figure, partially hidden by undergrowth, hesitated, glancing both ways before advancing along the far side. The posture was tense, every motion deliberate. Miss Marple observed the careful placement of feet, the slight twist of the body to avoid branches, and the subtle tightening of fingers around a concealed object. Each gesture was consistent with the behavior she had witnessed along the trail from the hill, through the lanes, and across the meadows. The evidence suggested a continuity of purpose, a methodical navigation of the terrain under conditions of vigilance and pressure. She followed the subtle impressions left behind, noting where the soil had shifted under weight, where tufts of fabric had snagged on brambles, and where the individual had briefly paused. The continuity of movement, the careful concealment of objects, and the urgency evident in the depth and spacing of footprints all pointed to a deliberate course of action. Each detail added clarity to the evolving narrative. The person had acted with both caution and purpose, navigating the landscape with an acute awareness of observation while leaving a readable trail behind them. Pausing at the edge of a small stream, Miss Marple examined the faint impressions in the muddy banks. Here, the individual had carefully stepped on stones to avoid sinking into the water, leaving shallow but clear footprints that recorded both direction and effort. The slight drag of a leather-bound package across a rock had left a mark, as had a brief contact of the glove against the bank. These subtle traces, combined with the sequence of objects collected along the trail, provided a precise picture of movement, intent, and careful concealment. The story was no longer fragmented. It was a continuous narrative, revealing both the actions taken and the psychological pressures guiding them. Beyond the stream, the trail curved toward a dense thicket, where the soil bore deeper impressions and disturbed foliage indicated a sudden increase in urgency. Miss Marple noted the careful method of concealment, the precise choice of paths, and the consistency of movement. Every footprint, smear of clay, and fragment of fabric reinforced the narrative, deliberate, cautious, and driven by purpose. The individual had acted with both fear and determination, navigating the terrain to protect the objects they carried while leaving a trail that, under patient observation, revealed the full sequence of actions. Standing at the edge of the thicket, Miss Marple surveyed the path that stretched from the copse to the meadows beyond. The continuity of evidence, from Fallow Hill to the northern lane, across the meadows, and now through this secluded area, was unmistakable. Footprints, fabric fragments, smears of clay, and hidden objects formed a coherent narrative of movement, intent, and careful concealment. The story had become visible in the soil, foliage, and human reactions observed along the way. With careful attention and continued observation, the full truth of the individual's purpose and the motivations behind these deliberate, cautious actions would soon be revealed. The morning sun rose slowly over Fallow Hill, casting long, golden fingers across the dew-dampened grass. Miss Marple stood at the crest of the hill, her keen eyes scanning the landscape she had traced so carefully over the past days. Each footstep, each fragment of fabric, each disturbed patch of earth had told its own part of the story, and now, with the trail leading her toward the final stretch of the northern lane and into the heart of the village, she could sense the story approaching its inevitable conclusion. There was a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as if the very village itself had paused to hold its breath, aware that the mystery it had unwittingly sheltered was about to reveal itself. She began her descent with measured steps, her mind replaying the chain of evidence that had brought her here. From the discovery of the first locket on Fallow Hill, through the careful trail of footprints and hidden objects across the lanes and meadows, every element had been deliberate, every movement recorded by the earth in its quiet, impartial way. The torn fabric fragments, the smears of clay, the repeated indications of urgency, all of it now pointed to a single conclusion. The movements were purposeful, calculated, and intimately connected to someone within the village's own bounds. Her thoughts were interrupted by a subtle rustling in the hedgerow ahead, a sound she had learned to interpret with precision. From the edge of the lane, a figure emerged, tall, cautious, with the familiar tilt of the head and the tension in the shoulders she had observed so many times before. It was the individual who had left the carefully concealed trail, the one whose actions had guided her through the sequence of hidden objects and hurried movements. Miss Marple watched silently, her sharp eyes noting the careful placement of each foot, the slight hesitation as the man paused to glance back at the lane, the subtle adjustments as he carried what she now recognized must be the final package in a series of carefully hidden items. She had expected confrontation, perhaps even fear, but instead she felt the quiet inevitability of understanding settle over her. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice calm yet imbued with authority. The figure started, turning sharply to meet her gaze. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of indecision in the eyes, before recognition and resignation replaced tension. "Miss Marple," the man began, his voice tentative, wary. I didn't think anyone would see. You have been very careful," she replied gently, taking a step closer. "But the earth always remembers. Every step, every adjustment, every small concealment has been recorded. It has told me your story long before words could." She paused, allowing the quiet of the morning to accentuate the weight of her observation. "And now, I believe it is time for the story to be completed." The man exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, as though her calm presence had removed the edge of fear that had guided his movements for so long. "I didn't mean any harm," he said, voice faltering. I had to protect it. I didn't know where else to go, and I didn't want anyone to find it." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging the sincerity of his words, but her mind continued to catalogue the sequence of events, reconstructing every movement with meticulous precision. "You are right to be cautious," she said. "But there is no need for secrecy now. The objects, the footprints, the hidden parcels, they have all been part of a larger puzzle, one that has now been pieced together. You acted under fear, yes, but also with purpose. And that purpose has led us here, to the truth that has been waiting quietly in the earth and in the observant eyes of this village." The man's gaze lowered to the final locket he had carried, and he extended it to her. Miss Marple accepted it, examining its surface. It bore scratches and faint marks, evidence of hurried handling and repeated concealment, yet it was unmistakably the final piece of a chain that began on Fallow Hill. She traced its contours with her gloved fingers, noting the familiar design, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Every element of the mystery, the objects, the footprints, the fragments of fabric, and the subtle reactions of the villagers, had converged into a coherent narrative that now required only one final step: understanding the motivation behind the actions. "You carried these objects to conceal them," she began, her voice calm but precise, and each step, each pause, each adjustment was both a choice and a reflection of your intent. But why? What was it you feared? Why take such pains to hide these items in places where anyone could eventually find them? The man hesitated, then spoke, his voice steadier. "They belonged to my family. The pendants, they were keepsakes handed down."
Through the tension with surgical precision, demanding an immediate explanation, not just for the affair, but for the profound public disgrace he had inflicted upon their family. There would be no more polite deferrals, no more turning a blind eye to his transgressions, not after this. The private agony had become a public spectacle, and Eleanor would no longer suffer it in silence. The Duke, initially defiant, crumbled under the weight of her unwavering gaze and the sheer magnitude of their shared catastrophe. The affair, he confessed, was a desperate search for solace, a pathetic attempt to fill an emotional void that had grown vast and unyielding within him. He spoke of the relentless pressures of his position, the suffocating expectations of their marriage, which he perceived as more of a political alliance than a union of hearts. He had felt adrift, unloved, his emotional needs unmet by a wife who, in his twisted perception, was too consumed by her duties, too focused on the grandeur of their station. Isabella, he claimed, offered him a brief, fleeting escape from the gilded cage of his life, a simplistic affection unburdened by the complexities of reputation or lineage. It was a self-pitying justification, a flimsy excuse that did little to assuage Eleanor's burning indignation, yet it laid bare the profound internal dissatisfaction that had driven him to such reckless betrayal. Eleanor listened, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. The betrayal was not merely carnal, it was a deeper wound, an affront to their shared history, their vows, and the very foundation of their public existence. He had not simply been unfaithful to her as a wife, he had been unfaithful to their name, to their legacy, and in a broader sense, to his nation, by compromising his integrity and making himself a laughingstock on the international stage. The trust, once an unspoken,
exhaled, satisfied that the truth had been revealed. Reaching the village square, Miss Marple turned to the man and spoke with a quiet firmness. The objects can be returned to their rightful place. Your fear has ended, and the secrecy is no longer necessary. The continuity of evidence has told us what we needed to know. That your intentions were protective, and that your actions, though hurried, were guided by care and concern. He nodded, grateful, and carefully handed over the final locket to her, allowing it to be restored to the family collection with a sense of resolution. The villagers, who had observed with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, now relaxed, murmuring among themselves with relief. There was no accusation, no recrimination, only the acknowledgement of a sequence of events that had unfolded with urgency, caution, and human intention. Miss Marple watched them, her mind cataloguing not only the physical traces, but the human reactions, the fleeting glances, the subtle gestures, and the quiet understanding that had grown alongside the tangible evidence. The story had been written not only in soil, foliage, and hidden objects, but also in the awareness of those who had witnessed its unfolding. As the day wore on, the narrative of Fallow Hill, the northern lane, the meadows, and the copse reached its natural conclusion. The objects were restored, the motivations understood, and the sequence of deliberate, cautious movements traced to their source. Miss Marple walked the final stretch of the lane, observing the footprints fading under the softening light, noting the subtle smears of clay and displaced leaves one last time. Every element had been accounted for, every action explained, and the full story of fear, protection, urgency, and human intention had emerged in clear, coherent form. Standing at the crest of Fallow Hill once more, Miss Marple gazed down upon the village bathed in the warm afternoon light. The mystery had been unraveled with patience, observation, and careful interpretation of evidence, both tangible and human. Footprints, hidden objects, fragments of fabric, and the subtle reactions of villagers had all contributed to the narrative, each element reinforcing the other until the full truth was apparent. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that what had been hidden, feared, and concealed was now understood, and that the continuity of evidence and observation had brought clarity where uncertainty had once reigned. The man, now at peace with the resolution, followed her gaze. "I never realized," he began, voice soft, "that the earth and the people could reveal so much." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Observation requires patience," she said. "Every step leaves a mark, every choice leaves a trace, and every human action carries meaning. All that was hidden has now been revealed, and in understanding, the story reaches its rightful end." As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows over Fallow Hill and the village beyond, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The footprints would fade, the soil would recover, and the objects restored to their rightful place. Yet the narrative, now fully interpreted, would remain in memory, a testament to the persistence of observation, the careful reading of subtle signs, and the patience required to discern truth from the traces left behind. In the quiet satisfaction of resolution, the village breathed again, its mysteries laid bare, its story complete, and its lessons quietly, indelibly recorded in both earth and human consciousness. The journey, though now concluded, had revealed more than the movements of a single individual. It had shown the profound interplay of human intention, fear, and care, recorded in the simplest of marks, yet discernible to the patient observer. Miss Marple turned, her gaze sweeping the hill, the lanes, and the meadows she had traced so thoroughly, and felt the quiet certainty of understanding. The narrative was whole, the mystery resolved, and the intricate web of actions, motives, and consequences had finally revealed itself in full clarity. The village settled into calm, the sequence of hurried footsteps and hidden objects transformed into a story of understanding, patience, and careful observation. Every detail had found its place, every action its explanation, and the gentle satisfaction of resolution pervaded the quiet streets and sunlit meadows. Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and patient mind, had traced the full narrative from its first, seemingly insignificant footprints to the final revelation of intent and truth. And in that accomplishment, the village found not only the resolution of a mystery, but also a quiet affirmation of the enduring power of observation, reason, and human insight.